everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Four Guys, a Girl, and a Show. With us, as always, is the original geeky vixen, Miss Stacy Rader.
Good evening.
G.I. Joe Quartermaster, Mike Hopkins.
Yo.
Our own Batmaniac, JQ.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
And myself, the self-proclaimed Professor of Comicology, Brian Isaacs. Our Jack of all trades, Dave Harriman's out saving lives tonight, so hopefully you'll be able to check in later. We got a great show tonight. Today, as a guest, is Denis Kitchen. He began his career as a cartoonist, as one of the original members of the underground comics movement in the late 60s, but he is best known as publisher and founder of Kitchen Sink Press. He later founded and chaired the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. His various professional hats also include being an editor, author of several books, a literary and art agent, curator, and a book packager.
Huh.
Denis, thank you so much for being on. We can't thank you enough.
No problem. Which hat do you want me to wear tonight?
All of them, if you don't mind switching around.
Sure.
Well, I understand you got a new book coming out based on Al Cap.
Yeah, he's long fascinated me, and I'm surprised no one else has done it. So it'll be out the end of this month from Bloomsbury.
Oh, nice. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's I think it's a definitive biography. I co-wrote it with Michael Schumacher, who some of you might know a year or two ago did a biography of Will Eisner. He's also done a lot of earlier biographical work on beat poets and musicians, directors. So he's someone who shared my fascination, and since, as you suggested from reading what I'm doing these days, I needed focus, and by co-writing, I was able to keep it on schedule and prevent it from being one of those things that are procrastinated. So it took us about 2 years. Tremendous amount of research, and Al Cap, I don't know, depending on your ages, all I can say is he was by far the best known cartoonist of his era, which would be from the 30s into the 70s.
Right.
And a very controversial guy for a lot of reasons, a genius by anyone's estimation, but a difficult human being, perhaps exacerbated by the fact that he lost a leg when he was 9 years old. So that was always something he had to live with, probably contributed to his general irascibility. But he was an amazing cartoonist, and unlike really any other cartoonist you can name, he was a public figure. Public in the sense that he was a regular on, say, the Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, most of the other top talk shows. He even had his own TV shows for a while in the 50s, his own game show. He had his own radio show, his own newspaper column. But his newspaper strip, Little Abner, was read at its peak by about 90 million people daily worldwide. So he had a huge audience. He was quite rich from it. And there's no other cartoonist you can name from that era or currently that's that kind of a public figure. And things got complicated in the mid-'60s when he made about a 180-degree political turn from being a lifelong kind of Roosevelt liberal to becoming quite right-wing and becoming actually a close friend with Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and a regular White House guest during the 70s. And then his career really got complicated when he was hit by a couple of sex scandals late in his career, and that brought him down and disgraced him. And my research shows that, in fact, the sex scandals, which were relatively mild by today's standards, were the very tip of the iceberg, and he probably was, for a good number of years, what we now call a sexual predator.
Wow.
So, complicated guy and a genius, and I just thought the story had to be told.
That's awesome. I mean, I grew up reading, the reruns of the reprints of Little Abner, and even some of those stories were definitely pushing the boundaries back then.
Yeah. He inserted a lot of blue humor, things that 99.9% of his readers wouldn't have seen even if you pointed at it. But a lot of dirty jokes, a lot of visual double entendres that now someone jaded like you would look at it and you would go, oh my God, I can't believe that was in a daily paper. But he did it in such a clever way that it really escaped almost everybody except maybe a special audience, So I think his whole life he was pushing the limit to see what he could get away with. Even overtly, you may recall the women in the strip were quite voluptuous and
Yes.
scantily clad
Yes.
in a way that no other strip had. If you look at it, look at any of the collections you have, almost any time there's a number mentioned, it's 69 cents or it's 69 miles or, he was born in, 69 or, and when you only drop that once every month or 6 or 8 weeks, people don't notice until you look for the pattern. And then you see the pattern. And again, on a video, on an audio broadcast I can't show you, but there are a couple of examples in the book that make it clear what he was doing.
Cool. That's great. Can't wait to check it out. Now, if you don't mind if we switch gears and actually talk about you for a little bit.
Whatever you want.
Now, you got your start with the underground comic movement. And from, you were one of those underground cartoonists. I mean, what was it like in working in that era? Working in that, being
it was, all I can say is it was liberating. I'm from a generation where I grew up with comics being censored by the Comics Code Authority.
Right.
And so I was just the right age to have remembered or to have gotten, in swaps with kids in the neighborhood who were a little older. I was able to get some of those early horror and crime comics that predated the code. And compared to the stuff that I was buying on newsstands in the 50s and 60s, clearly, while some of it, let's face it, justifiably horrified parents, it was the kind of stuff that made the medium exciting and daring and subversive. And so when I was in college and I was an aspiring cartoonist, probably if you had asked me when I was, a junior in college what I was going to do, I was probably going to apply to the local newspaper and get a job as an illustrator or work for an ad agency, something pretty mundane. But about that time, the Vietnam War was peaking, and there was this whole movement built around an anti-war feeling that we call now the counterculture.
Right.
People look back, they say we were hippies. We didn't use the word hippies. If we called ourselves anything, it was freaks, which is a term that maybe only a few people recall. The Freak Brothers kind of summed that one up.
Yep.
But what I found was I had some kindred spirits in the city I was in, Milwaukee, and nearby Chicago. And basically, I began self-publishing, got in contact with Jay Lynch, Skip Williamson, Robert Crumb, Art Spiegelman. There was a loose network around the country. And what we found was we could use that medium that we loved to express ourselves at a time when protest was pretty much everywhere. It wasn't just the war. There were all these movements that were simmering and breaking loose. The civil rights movement certainly was still active. You had the gay rights movement was in its early formation. The women's liberation movement, the legalized pot movement, there's a lot going on. And so all of us who had long hair and smoked pot were an easily identifiable part of the culture and pretty much diametrically opposed to what the generations in power believed and were trying to enforce. So for us, it was exciting. We were able to do black and white comics because that's what we could afford to print, occasionally color, but we could basically ignore the comic code authority. We could use four-letter words. We could use nudity. We could openly have drugs and plots, politics, anything. Nothing was taboo. And in that atmosphere, as you can imagine, some things were probably excessive and self-indulgent and pick a word, but it was also exciting. And while we couldn't have been aware at the time, the taboos we were breaking actually changed the larger industry. Partly it was the aesthetic, but really it was also economic, because one of the things we did, and I have to say again, I was wearing two hats back then because I was a cartoonist, but I quickly became a publisher out of necessity. And I couldn't have told you what a publisher was a month before I became one. But you learn pretty quickly. And because at the time, the politics in some cases were downright Marxist and revolutionary, what came out of that was a sense of fairness. And we didn't probably realistically think there was going to be a true revolution in America, but we certainly could treat ourselves, our comrades, in a fairer way than we would have been treated by the establishment publishers. As you probably know, working for the man back then, Marvel, DC, and the other comic companies, was a flat page rate, and that was it. They kept your art, they owned the copyright, they owned the characters, they could do whatever they wanted with it. If it was reprinted in Germany, who cares? You didn't get another dime. It was, you got your page rate, you go away, and if you were nice, they'd give you a gig the next month. Well, we rejected all of that. We saw comics as no different than the literary world, and authors get a royalty based on how many books sell, and it's pretty easy to calculate. It's typically 10% of cover price, so that's what we did with comics. So as a publisher, if printed a book and it was reprinted, you'd get paid again when it was reprinted. If it was translated, you'd get more money when it was translated. Very basic stuff. We also believe the art intrinsically belonged to the creator, so it was returned. Things like that were just unheard of. And so while we certainly didn't ever overtake the large companies in terms of sales and market share, we didn't even compete with them because we were sold in places like head shops, not newsstands.
Right.
But eventually, and it took a few years, it became the model that became more generally accepted. And now creator-owned properties and royalties are the norm. Even the major companies, while they still own the copyright, they work out special deals. They will pay types of royalties and residuals and bonuses and so on. So that was an unexpected result of what, us long-haired kids were doing back in the late 60s and early 70s. And when you're involved in it, you don't really think what the impact is. You're just doing it.
I got to tell you, Dennis, my first exposure to you personally had to be with the Spirit Jam issue that came out. And
yeah.
That was my first exposure to you. And actually, that was kind of also my first exposure to Eisner, to be honest. But that was my first exposure to you. So.
Well, that was fun to do. Yeah, jams are an example of just, again, having fun with the medium. And it came, literally from passing pages around the room when cartoonists would gather. And we tried with the Spirit, at least, to make it what we called an organized jam with a little bit of cohesion. Sometimes they tend to devolve into anarchy. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. That's probably a pretty good introduction.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, I think that's where the phrase Eisner Spritz, at least I know,
Yes,
first showed up.
it is. Harvey Kurtzman coined it, which I thought was a perfect Yiddish-sounding word for what Will did.
It was funny because when that Spirit movie came out, I think that was one of my biggest complaints, and people will look at, going on these boards complaining the Eisner Spritz isn't there, and people are like, the what? I'm
Yeah.
like, oh.
You speak the language.
Yes, I do, unfortunately. And, it's because of, you formed a kitchen sink press. That's how I got, I remember collecting the reprints of the Spirit you guys were doing. Thank you very much for that, personally.
Sure.
You also, you had Zeonic Tales, which, ended up becoming this, stayed under the radar, but ended up becoming a cartoon, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. You guys had the Pro for a little while.
Right.
Megaton Man, and then, I especially love the old reprints, the Flash Gordon I really enjoyed, Steve Cannon. Those were probably, of course, the Spirit probably had to be some of my best, my favorite that I really loved. I was actually getting on a monthly basis.
We kind of take those for granted now because a lot of companies are doing them and doing them very well. But back then, they were almost impossible to find. And so I did those to a large degree out of selfishness because I wanted to see them collected. So part of my publishing philosophy was if I wanted it, I presumed a certain number of other people would. I gambled a few thousand, maybe many thousand, would share that. And more often than not, that gut feeling was correct. So again, when I was in college, I came across the Spirit originally in Harvey Kurtzman's Help magazine, just one story excerpted, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. How can I get more? There wasn't anything. 1966, Harvey Comics put out 2 issues that was mostly reprint and some new material. And again, I gobbled those up, but there were no more. And so a few years went by, and in 1971, I met Will at a New York Comic Con. It was the first one either of us attended. And getting to meet him was a thrill. And based on that meeting, kind of I would say a chance meeting, except oddly enough, it was he who sought me out because he was curious about the underground comics. So the benefit directly from that was getting to do the Spirit reprints and then ultimately getting Will to retire from his daily gig and start doing comics again. And, before, it's funny, at the time I thought he was an old man. He was in his mid-50s and I was in my early 20s. And anybody, when you're in your early 20s, everybody looks old now. Of course, I'm older than Will was at the time, and I don't consider myself really old, but it's relative. But I was so impressed in 1971 that he sought me out. He knew just enough about undergrounds to be dangerous because he had been asking questions, and so he basically brought me into a private suite he had at the hotel in New York, and he began asking me about how exactly we sold these comics and how we compensated creators and some of the things I touched on earlier. And each time I explained what we did, he just shook his head in a way that he said, God, I wish I had that when I was starting out. Because he was starting out in, really a circumstance in the 1930s where the publishers were all powerful.
Yeah.
And the fact that he was as creative as he was in those circumstances is testimony to Will's letting his aesthetic dominate over circumstances. And he always had that business instinct, but his, he understood that the reality of the situation then was you were stuck with newsstand distribution. Newsstand distribution equated to basically a mafia-controlled business, and the guy, who basically took over DC Comics, Donenfeld, was a crook who forced out the guy who really started DC Comics, and Donenfeld and Leibowitz. Basically, we know the whole story of how they acquired Superman and everything else. It was an engulf and devour kind of a philosophy, and every other comic publisher was pretty much the same, with the exception of again, I'm forgetting his name. The guy who did Crime Does Not Pay.
Oh, easy.
Yeah, he was I think quite literally a socialist who actually did profit sharing with his staff. But 90% of these guys were the worst kind of greedy businessmen, and they had no appreciation, I don't think, for the aesthetic potential of comics. It was just a business. And it was a great business because, they were selling millions and millions and millions of comics. I think it was like 80 million a month was the circulation in the 40s. And even though comics were a dime, think what a dime was worth relative to today, it was a lot of money. So by the time, I met Will Eisner, he had gone through that mill and, done some wonderful things in terms of packaging, and then The Spirit, which lasted 12 years, and then he got into educational comics and working for the government. And he was ready for something fresh, and was by that point financially secure enough that he could pretty much do whatever he wanted. And it's rare, as you probably know, for most artists to be in a situation where they can do whatever they want. Usually it's a gig, and you got to do what the boss tells you to do.
Is that what led to Contract with God?
Right.
That is one of my all-time favorite stories. It's just so powerful, and I know the history. Some of the history of a lot of the cartoonists were Jewish, but you don't see that, and to see Will go back to his Jewish roots as a Jew myself,
yeah,
I really found it like interesting and yet entertaining at the same time.
Yeah.
But
Now, Dennis, you going back to something you said earlier. You were saying about how working for the companies, working for the man. I speak to a lot of artists now, through my travels, and a lot of them look for that creator-owned, a clause. So if they draw it or they ink it or whatever they do, they want to keep it. Is that something that you've been seeing, or is that what you've been fighting to protect? I mean,
well, a lot depends. A lot depends on the company, Jay. It's still with Marvel and DC, their so-called creator contracts are fairer than they used to be, but you still don't really own it. Even if you technically own the copyright, I've seen these contracts. They control them into perpetuity. Just because you own the copyright doesn't mean anything if you give them the right to exploit it forever, which is basically what these contracts say. But psychologically, it makes you feel good that you technically own the copyright. That's better than not owning it. But the contracts are still, in my opinion, quite onerous. But the smaller and middle-sized companies, they have genuine creator-owned deals. So Dark Horse, for example, or IDW, or Fantagraphics, or Image, companies that are that size, they will genuinely let the artist own and control their property. Of course, they have certain rights, and they have to make a profit, and they're not foolish. But those are real. The big companies, you got to remember, DC is a tiny part of Warner, and Marvel is now owned by Disney. These are not friendly corporations. So again, if an artist asks me my opinion and they want to do, say, superheroes, well, they really, the only place to do superheroes and make some good money is probably Marvel or DC. And so it's a trade-off. And if you like the size of the check and you like the incentives they give you, that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. It's not a choice I would personally make. You could be a Mike Mignola and create a hero, like Hellboy, for example, and still control it, work with a company like Dark Horse and own it, have a movie based on it and have a genuine influence on how it's made, or Frank Miller with Sin City. These are people who have creator-owned deals and have made a lot of money and retain total control. And you've got every degree of gray in between. To me, the Miller-Mignola approach is the smarter way to go. But let's face it, most creators really never have that choice. For one thing, most creators are either just an artist or just a writer. You don't have that many auteurs who can do both. And then, even then, sometimes you fall into what I would call an economic trap, where you're a very good writer and you're given, pick a character, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and you do very well with it, and they pay you well, and you just keep doing that, and it never crosses your mind that you need to own it or be in control any more than somebody who writes Hollywood screenplays. They don't own that copyright either. But if you get paid enough, that's fine. That's your job. There are some of us who just feel if you create something, you ought to own it and control it, even if you rent it now and then. So,
do you feel the economic trap, as you put it, is going to be a downfall to the industry, or do you think it's just the way to get by?
Well, first of all, it's evolving in a positive direction. So I don't want to make it sound like it's awful by any means. It was awful in the 30s. It was awful in the 40s. It was awful in the 50s. It's getting better and better because what's changed, as you know, as fans, is now you tend to go into a store and you're looking for things by certain people. You might like a character, but instead of just automatically buying Roachman because you've got every copy of Roachman ever made, you're going in there and you're saying, hey, what's new by Joe Blow or whatever. And that's a trend that only helps the creator because it's like the star system. Same thing happened in Hollywood. Remember, originally the actors were pretty anonymous, but when actors and actresses started to get names and become recognizable, the people who made movies realized, wow, people want to see Rudolph Valentino or Mary Pickford, and so these people use that clout to leverage better deals. But with the exception of Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin and who was the other guy who formed United Artists, the truth is rarely do artists ever get to be in control. The publisher, the producer, these people have the capital and they control distribution. And so even if you technically own it, you're still at the mercy of a company that treats you fairly. What's great today is you've got some healthy competition, and the marketplace is, by and large, is still supporting graphic novels outside of comic shops. So you've got a chance to get into the Barnes & Noble and the Amazon chain and so on, and you're not completely dependent on, say, Diamond and the core market. But I personally still think the core market's very important because that's still the place where a truly independent, say a self-published person like the next Dave Sim who wants to do Cerebus or Jeff Smith who wants to do Bone, you need that core fan market to ever get a foothold and potentially break out.
All right.
So, Dennis, you mentioned that with certain things like reprinting the Spirit and things like that with Kitchen Sink, it was somewhat something that you had a passion for. Um, with artists like Charles Burns, some of the more alternative artists in the 80s and 90s, was it the same thing, or how did you get involved with some of those artists?
Absolutely. I had the luxury, Stacy, of doing literally whatever I wanted. I had, depending on the era, I had anywhere from a handful of employees to 30 employees. So I had to be responsible in the sense of not doing something so stupid that the business would go under and 20 or 30 people would lose their jobs. But aside from that, by and large, yes, I could do whatever I wanted. And my gut feeling was, as I said earlier, if I really love, let's say, Charles Burns, and I know my break-even point on a book is 2,500 or 3,000 copies, I know I'm going to sell that many. I know I'm going to sell twice that many, 3 times that many, and so I roll the dice. It's me who has to pay the printer. It's me who has to pay for the promotion and the staff to assemble these things and to give Charles an advance and so on. But I'm gambling money that I'm confident I'm going to get back. But what's really driving me is I think this is really cool. I think this is something I'd like to have in my own library. And I can't say I ever did anything crass that I thought is just going to make money. That happened occasionally. But the vast majority of the time, I only published it if I was personally enthused. And I wish I could say that was the case for most other publishers. I think that's unusual. I think that there are other small publishers who absolutely have that same passion. I would say Drawn and Quarterly for the most part, probably the guys who own Fantagraphics and even IDW and Dark Horse. I would put them in that category. But at a certain point, businesses become corporations owned by other people. You have to answer to stockholders, and pretty soon that whatever that original passion might have been is diluted by business forces. But as soon as I saw Charles Burns' work back in probably the 80s, I loved it, and I knew that he was going to go somewhere, and he did. Sometimes you're wrong, but there are a lot of people I saw at the very beginning who I instantly had really good feelings about. When I was a teenager reading Help magazine with Harvey Kurtzman, he was giving little single-panel gag cartoons to young artists like Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson and Joe Beck and guys who became, just a short time later, the core of the underground movement. And he gave Robert Crumb his first national exposure, and Gilbert Shelton. And as soon as I saw those guys, I didn't know who they were. I didn't even know they were roughly my age. I just thought, wow, this is great stuff. And within a very short period of time, they were communicating with each other. I got to communicate with them, and that was the core. So Harvey Kurtzman in many ways was the catalyst, the spark that united those young artists who were scattered all over the country. But somebody like Robert Crumb, has now evolved into somebody who almost transcends comics. He's probably a guy right now in the fine art world. He has exhibits. He just had one recently at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. We're talking serious art people going in and looking at his stuff and buying his stuff. He's in a whole other category than any other cartoonist I can think of. You look at other forces that are now taking place. It's not just getting your book published and getting a royalty and so on. Now the original art itself is being taken seriously in art circles. If you follow Heritage at all, you see some rather astonishing prices being paid for work by Crumb and Frank Miller, Todd McFarlane. And again, just because someone will pay, that doesn't automatically mean that's fine art or that it will sustain that value, but that you have very, very healthy secondary market for art. The creme de la creme, or maybe creme de la creme, is genuinely sought after, and it's not just by comic fans. I've because I represent the Eisner and Kurtzman estate and other artists, I can tell you I'm seeing collectors who are not people who are going to walk into a comic shop, not going to stand in line in San Diego Comic-Con. These are serious business professionals who are collectors, who in some cases collect real fine art with a capital F and a capital A, and they also love original cartoon art. So this is a whole other phenomenon that's happening here that is just in recent years. As you probably know, back in the old days, cartoon art was often routinely destroyed and not taken very seriously.
That's really sad. That makes me sad.
Well,
makes me sad to think about.
You mean that it was destroyed in the old days?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was destroyed.
I know. I've heard so many horror stories. It is awful, but then a fair amount of it survived too, and it is what it is. I mean, you can say the same thing about the old silent films. Studios weren't saving those. I think a very high percentage of those literally are extinct. At least with comics, you have the printed version. With the old silent films, you have nothing.
That's true. So I wanted to ask you about the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and kind of the story behind how that got started.
Sure. I think it was 1986. I just got a call at the office one day from a guy named Frank Mangia-Racina. He was a distributor in Indiana who owned a half a dozen or so retail shops in Indiana and Illinois. And he said his shop in Lansing, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, had been busted. And among the things that were confiscated was Omaha the Cat Dancer that I published. And it was a title, if you've seen it, it has X-rated elements, but it's a highly literary, kind of a soap opera that was written by Kate Worley and drawn by Reed Waller. And it was a series I was very proud of. And so I was kind of pissed off that happened, and I said, well, let me know if I can help. But in truth, there wasn't a way to help in a meaningful way, and so I just kind of followed what happened. And so the manager of the store was literally charged with selling obscene material, and he faced, I think it was a year in prison and a several $1,000 fine. And so Frank just hired a local attorney who was not an expert in First Amendment law. And next thing I knew, his manager was convicted. And it just seemed to me awful that could have happened. And the other things that were busted were also, I think, what you would regard as kind of innocuous. Heavy metal was busted, and I think Wonder Woman posters were confiscated because the cop thought they were satanic. And as soon as I heard that the cop thought this stuff was satanic, I realized we've got a religious nut here. This has nothing to do with, the law. This is a case of situational power where a guy in the beat is going to force his moral code on a guy trying to make an honest living. So at that point, I really did get upset, and I decided I am going to do something. And so I called about a dozen top artists, including Will Eisner and Crumb and Richard Corbin and Sergio Aragonés, some people who would never in 1,000 years have their own work busted, but who thought it was unfair that this case was coming down. And I asked them to each do an original for a portfolio. And I got my printer to agree to print it at cost. I got the distributors to agree to waive their normal markup. And, make the long story short, raised over $20,000 from this portfolio, and that allowed us to hire a real First Amendment attorney, a guy named Bert Joseph, who was in Chicago. He had been someone who had helped found the Playboy Foundation and had defended people like Hugh Hefner in previous years, and so he was able to get this case overturned, and that got the manager off the hook. And at that point, there was a few $1,000s left, and I had just been handling this all myself, and I decided I could have just given the extra money to any charity, but it occurred to me, gosh, maybe there could be other cases like this. Maybe this should be a permanent organization. And so that's how the fund started. And I had no idea there would be other cases and a lot of other cases. And what I realized was 90-some% of these just went below the radar. You only knew about it if it was in your own hometown or locality, and you might have seen a headline on page 17. Nobody was paying much attention, and shops are easily intimidated. Put yourself in that position. If a cop comes in and says he doesn't like something you're selling, probably you're going to remove it. Probably you don't want trouble. You're not likely to say, it's none of your damn business what I sell, it's my right to. Most shop owners are pragmatic. They have to be. So once the fund was established and we had an 800 number, and pretty soon we had a part-time executive director and then eventually full-time, these shops knew they could call this 800 number and we could immediately put them in touch with a regional attorney who was a specialist who could, in many cases, get the prosecutor or whoever it was to just call off the dogs. But there were just dozens of cases that none of us ever would have even heard of had there not been a central kind of umbrella organization. So what started not exactly as a lark, but as a single case focus, inadvertently turned into this national organization. And so, what can I say? It's turned out to be probably the only organization everybody in the industry kind of supports. Imagine there are few curmudgeons who don't believe in the First Amendment, but for the most part, it's one thing we can agree on. And it's not even always about sex. Sometimes it's we had a case in California that involved actually sales taxes, where they tried to impose a sales tax on Paul Mavrides, a San Francisco cartoonist. When he was mailing his art to his publisher, who was also in California, they wanted to impose a sales tax on that, which is crazy. Now, he could have paid the $100 or whatever and just said, forget it. But he said, this is outrageous. I'm not going to pay sales tax on mailing my art to my publisher. We spent $40,000 overturning that because we had to fight the state of California Board of Equalization. It was crazy. But we raised the money, we fought it, we prevailed. No one else has tried to do it since. But it's not always about sex.
So you were quoted when you left the fund as saying you thought that the challenges facing comics are different than when you first founded the fund. Would you care to elaborate on what you think the challenges today are and how they're different?
Well, I said that in the press release, and I stand by it. But the truth is, having started it, and I ran it for 18 years, honestly, I was just getting a little tired. And I wasn't focusing the way I once was, and I decided it needed fresh blood. And I think that was a smart thing to do. I think every organization needs to just rejuvenate itself periodically, and I didn't want to be the pope of this thing just because I started it. I just thought it was time to step down. And I mean, it's as simple as that. as we established at the beginning, I have my fingers in a lot of things, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. And I think to truly run an organization like that, you have to have enough time to really be paying attention to the cases, working with the attorneys who are focused on the regional cases. You have to spend time dealing with the board. You have to have a lot of conference calls. You have to read lots of emails. And after doing that for 18 years, honestly, I just thought I'm not doing it with the enthusiasm I was the first 17 years. and as a result, when I left, one of the last things I did was I forced term limits so that everyone else pretty much is forced to do the same thing I did. Is you hang it up after a couple of terms and let new people in, and I think it's rejuvenated the organization.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of passion for it. I've talked to people at several conventions that you have the CBLDF booth, and there's definitely a lot of passion for it in the community. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess what still amazes me is there's still so many places in the country, and I guess if you had to generalize, it's probably the Bible Belt where there's still a lot more resistance probably to controversial comics. But they're all over, and there's one recently involving crossing the border into Canada and having internet comics now are something that are being looked at, and there's a case right now where a guy was convicted of having. This was not one where the fund was able to defend him, but there was one where a guy had alleged child pornography cartoons, but no one outside of the authorities have even seen them. So we don't know if they really were, despicable or whether they were relatively harmless, because the truth is there's a lot of gray area here. And sometimes you have to defend things that are sort of despicable just to maintain the principle. And it's not easy, I don't know if any of you remember a case we had with a guy named Mike Diana in Florida some years back. This was a guy, they first found him when there was a murderer in Gainesville, Florida. They thought it might be serial murder, and they were looking at anybody suspicious in Gainesville, and somebody pointed the finger at this guy, Mike Diana, who was doing these little self-published zines where he probably literally had 30 Xerox copies, and it was blasphemous pornography where he would basically have Jesus having sex with somebody. It was very primitive style. It was nothing anybody would have paid any attention to until he was suspected of being a murderer. Well, when they called him in and they checked out his alibis and everything, he had nothing whatever to do with the murder. But they thought, well, while we have him, we might as well bust him for these, awful comic books he's producing. So, of course, we defended him, and I have to say this was a pretty frustrating case because it's the first one we lost. We very seldom lose. But the jury he had in Florida was not a jury of his peers. As you would expect in Florida, it was an older, retired jury. And they just found what he did thoroughly repulsive and disgusting. And I would have to say probably they were. But did he have a right to do them under the First Amendment? Well, we certainly argued that he did. He wasn't harming anyone. He wasn't selling them to minors. But here's the part that really drove us crazy. The judge who sentenced him, the sentence included that he could not draw even in the privacy of his own home, and he was subject to periodic spot checks by the authorities. We found that beyond the pale, and we appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear it, and so it was upheld. So now you have a precedent for a judge being able to tell an artist he cannot draw in the privacy of his own home.
That is just amazing.
That's a pretty chilling one.
That's messed up.
Yeah. So far, as I know, that's not a precedent that's been used by any other judge, but it's still a disturbing thing to have on the record, and that the Supreme Court didn't think it was important enough to review. And I know that, they have hundreds and hundreds of cases, and they have to pick carefully, but to us, that was a flagrant misapplication of any First Amendment interpretation, and yet there it is. So, in any event, I'm glad, Stacy, that you appreciate it, and what's gratifying to me is to see how in every town where there are booths set up, there are volunteers, who don't get paid, who just stand there and help disseminate the literature and raise funds and so forth. It's very gratifying to see.
Hey, Dennis, this is Mike. I'd like to ask you a question. With new artists and new writers coming through daily, what would be your biggest opinion of the business that you would share with them?
Well, you mean you're talking about advice to someone trying to break in?
Yes, sir.
Well, depending on their age, at conventions, I'll see sometimes, talent in their mid-teens, late teens, and I would give them probably different advice than somebody who's maybe after college or, in their middle or late 20s. For one thing, and it's hard, you have to have a certain talent, and I'll just put the air quotes around talent, because you can have a relatively primitive style and still be very funny or very engaging storyteller, but for the most part you have to be a really good artist to make it. And while there are funny cartoons, the truth is this is an industry dominated by adventure, heroic, superhero comics. So you have to draw convincingly in what we call a realistic way. Likewise for a writer, you have to be able to tell stories in that vein. So if someone actually shows me samples and I think they're really talented and I think they could make it, then it really comes down to what you want to do, and that is full circle back to what we talked about earlier, which is if you just need a job and you just want to make money, if you can draw convincing superheroes, then probably you want to, get in line and try to break into Marvel or DC or somebody doing that kind of material, and protect yourself as best you can. But the truth is, it's the comic book equivalent of going to work at a factory, which is you punch in and you put in your hours and you get a check. And if I see that someone is more ambitious and has an ambition beyond just a job, then I would have them look at other role models. And you look at things out there like, say, blankets that might have taken several years to produce. Thompson was probably starving while he was doing that. You look at a number of things out there that Margine Satrapi and Persepolis, and things that are different, that break the mold, that are very personal visions of the world, sometimes autobiographical or biographical, or things that are much closer to literature than to superhero comics. Those are the ones I personally hope can stick with it, because the truth is it's very, very difficult. If you're new, it's highly unlikely a publisher is going to give you a meaningful advance. And some of these things by nature take a long time to produce. So you pretty much have to have a day job and then moonlight on this and be patient. It's not an easy field to break into. So to be honest, there's no quick and easy answer to give to anybody. And it's probably similar to, if somebody came up to somebody was a successful actor or comedian or a field where it's always the creative fields have people who think, I want to get in, how do I do it? And the truth is it's partly luck and it's partly skill and it's partly happenstance. And a lot of really, really talented people fall by the wayside because they weren't lucky or they weren't in the right place at the right time, or they weren't in a situation where they could invest months or maybe even years of their time to wait for that break. And sometimes it's because it's a very practical thing. Maybe they got married and they have a kid and they just can't do it. I know when I think back to when I broke in, I was a bachelor. And I was living in an apartment that I shared with 4 or 5 other guys, and the rent was $75 a month. I had to come up with $15 a month. I was boiling hominy and cauliflower and whatever I could afford back then. I was almost literally starving, but all I cared about was making comics. And so slowly but surely, I was able to get a foothold and then eventually make a living at it and eventually carve out a bit of an empire on a small scale. But it wasn't easy at the beginning. And it's hard to look someone in the eye and say, hey, you want to starve for months or a couple of years and postpone having a family and listen to your parents tell you you're a bum? Might involve that.
That's interesting because you hear that a lot though from even down to the music artists and everybody. It's just an interesting concept that the term starving artist is so readily used.
Yeah, sometimes it's literal.
Except for now,
I laugh about it now, but I'm telling you, I mean, I'm 6'5". When I was a starving cartoonist, I think I weighed 138 pounds. I'm not joking. I mean, I had very little nutrition in those days, but I loved comics. I probably have gained 80 pounds since then. I'm not an obese person now. I'm probably a relatively normal weight for my height now. But when I was young, eating was a secondary thing. And I would have a roommate maybe who worked at a restaurant and he would bring home leftovers. Or, I had friends who actually graduated with me who had a real job and they would take pity on me. And I had a guy I graduated, I was a journalism major, and he got an actual job as a journalist, and he was making $400 a week, which back then seemed like a fortune to me. I couldn't imagine somebody making $1,600 a month. My God. I was in a good month, maybe made a tenth of that. So he would drop by and, he would literally slip me a $20 bill and take pity on me. And that would, I'm so grateful to him. Now, that guy ended up being my editor-in-chief. I ended up hiring him. But initially, I was basically the homeless person on the street that he was putting coins in the cup because he thought I wasn't a bum. He knew I was working on a project, and it would probably take me a while to get on my feet. And he was right. But those first couple of years were tremendously difficult. And I have to say to anybody, I'm not saying it's going to be a pattern quite like that, but in your own way, you have to struggle. Now, sometimes people are an overnight success. At least it seems like that in hindsight. But almost everybody is investing a lot of time. And comics, unless you draw like Charles Schultz, it takes time to make those panels look right. It takes time to compose a page. It takes time to do a graphic novel. I mean, it can easily take a year 2 years to do an ambitious project, sometimes more. Like I said, look at blankets. I can't remember how much time he put into that. That thing, it's about 1.5 inches thick. Howard Cruz, when he did forgetting the name, the one he did for Paradox Press for DC about gay life in the South, he got what seemed like a decent advance from DC for that, but after a year he ran out of money, and he still had to work another year or two until he finished it. And so again, Howard did it, but he was selling his art. He was relying on his roommate to support him. And it finally came out, and it got a lot of acclaim. It still didn't become a bestseller, but it took 3 years. When he signed the contract, he said, "Sure, I can do it in a year." It's just not that easy. Anybody involved in any creative field knows until you sit down and roll up your sleeves, you don't know how long it's going to take. It's like writing this Al Cap book. I mean, it was part-time over 2 years. It could easily have been, even more time. I mean, you can research these things forever, but you have to put a timeline on. You have to meet a publisher's deadline, and that's the practical part of it. And if the other thing, to get back to your original question, is there's still the option of self-publishing, which is what Dave Sim and Jeff Smith are exemplars of. It's not always that easy. Actually, there are some others too who have been. Terry Moore, I think, is another good example with Strangers in Paradise. But there too, you have to have a certain business sense. You have to be willing to deal with the mundane part of the business. You have to deal with a printer. You have to deal with a distributor. You have to collect money. You have to, quickly become a businessman if you weren't, or maybe if you're lucky, you have a spouse who takes care of it. But that's still an option in our field. I think that shouldn't be discounted.
I gotta ask you, Dennis, how did you get into, now you're like an art agent and you handle the estate for Eisner and Kurtzman. How did you get involved in that?
Well, you know what? You in those cases, they became more than artists. They became almost father figures to me, and I became close to their family, to their wives. When they died, the relationship was close enough that they asked me to handle the business, and I consider that a privilege. It's a great responsibility. When you're in the business long enough and you acquire certain skills, some things. It's hard to even call myself an agent. I don't want to be an agent, but I am, because I know how to be one. What I want to be is a cartoonist. What I want to do is write, and but I have a lot of other obligations, and part of it is representing other talent. And so when I do, I have to take that very responsibly. It's at some point it might be like the CBLDF, where I say, enough already, someone else can do this. But for this period of time, and I have partners too. It's not just me single-handedly. I have a partner with the Eisner estate and a different partner with the Kurtzman estate. And it got really complicated because I represented the Cap estate, and when I started digging up stuff on Al Cap, the family was not too happy. I can tell you that became actually quite uncomfortable. But I told them at the beginning, if I was writing this book, it was going to be truthful, and it was going to be warts and all, and I wasn't going to hold back. And They weren't too happy about it, but at the end of the day, they accepted it. But that put me in kind of a conflict of interest, you might appreciate. It also put me in kind of a legal complication because the images in the book were owned by the estate, and I needed their permission. And there was actually some tense moments where they were threatening to withhold that permission if I didn't agree to take some things out of the book or reword some things. And we had a standoff.
Wow.
So I fully expected that I was going to get fired as their literary agent because it was a conflict. At the end of the day, we worked it out. And but these are things that you just have to go in and you have to sometimes take a principled stand. And I was perfectly willing, in this case, to be fired as their agent, and I was perfectly willing, if necessary, to not get their permissions and to find other illustrations that might be public domain, or I mean, it would have been not the best book, but I was able to talk to them. You have to understand, this is Al Cap's daughter I'm dealing with. She doesn't want to hear that her father was a sexual predator.
Right.
You can understand that.
Yeah.
She knew he was a bit of a scamp, but we came up with things that frankly horrified her, and I would be horrified too if that was my father, but that's part of the story.
Just amazing.
So, it's a funny business, but not always literally funny. No.
I guess I just have like one last question for you. And it's kind of an odd question, but you've been in the industry long enough. How do you feel about the way the industry is going with digital comics? Do you feel it's going to hurt the local comic shops? Do you think it's a good idea, bad idea, or just it is what it is?
Well, yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter what either of us thinks because it's here to stay, I think. And I think, on balance, I think it's an exciting thing. Had there been an internet when I was starting, I wouldn't have had the same kinds of obstacles to overcome. I dealt with a very, very different system. And so if I'm a young cartoonist now and I've got digital comics as an option, I'm thrilled because if I do it right, I've got an unlimited potential audience out there that's relatively inexpensive to reach. In other words, I had to literally pay a printer to self-publish my first comic. I think it was something like $800 at a time when that was a fortune because, printing's not cheap. And today, you could reach far more people than I could reach digitally. Now, it's hard for me to say with complete confidence because it's not an area that I'm terribly immersed in. I mean, I look at stuff online. I'm following what Comixology is doing, and it's clear that the numbers keep going up significantly. Every publisher is now doing digital editions of their work. As an author, I was thrilled to find out Abrams told me that The Art of Harvey Kurtzman is now available in a digital version. I was just told by Norton that they're beginning to put Will Eisner's work online, starting with comics and sequential art.
Nice.
So these are this is just another platform to deal with, and I have my iPad now, and I can appreciate that that I can store things on there that can replace a lot of white boxes, to put it in comic book terms. That doesn't mean I'm ever going to not prefer, in my case, my library, because I've assembled it over decades, and I take pride in it, and I love pulling books off the shelf, and I love that tactile sensation. I realize that's partly a generational thing. I'm kind of in a geezer category now. it is what it is. But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate digital comics. And I think it's just one additional weapon for a young artist to use. And if it was me, I'd probably still want a print edition, but I sure as heck would take full advantage of what the website can do. Just in terms of promoting too. I mean, if you network properly and you can get scads and names that otherwise would be hard to assemble in the old way. When I remember, it was painful to try to assemble a mailing list of fans back in the day when people didn't want to rent lists or share lists. You had to painfully assemble them. We would run ads in Comics Buyer's Guide and Comics Journal and places like that with coupons, and people would send in their coupons and we'd have to transcribe them onto lists, and we had to all these things in the pre-computer day, to get a few thousand names so that we could mail them our catalogs. Well, now, think how much easier that is. It's pushing buttons, and it's all time-saving devices. Even drawing. I mean, I see there, a lot of artists these days using styluses, and it's not something I'm comfortable doing, but I'm envious when I see how they do a sketch. They can erase it digitally and then correct it, and I'm thinking, man, I still have to erase pencil lines and then re-ink them and use whiteout because I'm an old-fashioned working on the drawing board kind of a guy. So I'm too old a dog to change, but I envy the hell out of the new generation that has that additional option.
I understand. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Everyone be on the lookout for Dennis's new book, Al Cap, Life to the Contrary, from Bloomsbury. Should be out later this month.
Yep.
Later this month. So is there anything else you'd like to promote, Dennis? Or?
Well, I mean, if you asked, I recently did a 5-page mini graphic biography of Dr. Seuss that'll be in a book coming out, I think, later this summer from Simon & Schuster called, I think it's Masterful Marks. Monty Beauchamp edited it. It's 10 cartoonists who changed the world. So they're different artists who interpreted the life of Disney and Crumb and Kurtzman, and if you can imagine 10 cartoonists who changed the world. So I got to do Dr. Seuss.
Wow.
That'll be fun. That's the only other thing pending, I think. Everything else is more long-term, but I appreciate the opportunity. I enjoyed talking to you. Stacy, Jay, Mike, it's been fun.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
You bet. Good night.
Well, that's it for our show. For Stacy, Mike, Dave, Jay, and myself. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Night all.